The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise and speak to Bill C-3. I would like to say, first of all, that we're going to support the bill at second reading, but that this isn't a really strong yes. There are some changes that need to be made in terms of marine security. There are some changes made here, but we could do a lot better. I would like to take a moment to read the title of the bill, because I think it's important for people's understanding. So, Bill C-3, an act to enact the Aviation Industry Indemnity Act, to amend the Aeronautics Act, the Canadian Marine Act, the Marine Liability Act, and the Canada Shipping Act 2001, and to make consequential amendments to other acts. So I think, Mr. Speaker, that just with the title, a lot of people would realize that this bill is more than 2 pages long. Clearly, we're going to affect or have an impact on a lot of different things. And we're going to try and approach this from a security perspective. So I think if you're going to launch this kind of a bill that's going to amend several different acts, it is worthwhile to really ensure that we would expand the implementation of this to ensure that everything is covered. Because when you launch into a study, for example, you realize perhaps later on that you might have added this aspect to it, there's a loss of effectiveness and efficiency here. When we talk about marine and aviation safety, it's important to do so. So that is why the NDP proposed to expand the bill, indeed, to include more concrete measures that would protect our Canadian shores and that would neutralize or minimize the conservative tentatives and in those that are dealing with the environment.
Doing a big study like that, when we have a bill that concerns different law, we have the responsibility to do this study really seriously, try to extend the study to every measure that can be concerned. And it's why NDP have proposed to really make a good study on this bill, to really cover all the file, and unfortunately conservatives say yes, no. So I think it's really disappointing when we want to try to have really good study, then having this attitude that just saying, no, this is our bill and it's what we are studying. NDP is really concerned to improve the law. It's not a question of partisanship, it's a question of improving Canadian law, and conservatives refuse to do it. So, je vais rapidement un peu expliquer.
I'm going to quickly explain the different pieces of legislation that are covered by this. The first part enacts the Aviation Industry Indemnity Act, and this will authorize the Minister of Transport to undertake to indemnify certain aviation industry participants. And what we're talking about for loss, damage, or liability caused by events that are commonly referred to as war risks. So we understand that this doesn't happen so often, but if this were to occur, if a carrier would find themselves suffering damages because a war was declared very quickly and unexpectedly, the Department of Transport could indemnify them. So I think this isn't a measure that would be used very often, but it is in the bill. Part 2 talks about the Aeronautics Act, and there it will provide certain persons with powers to investigate aviation accidents or incidents involving civilians in aircraft or aeronautical installations operated by or on behalf of the Department of National Defence, the Canadian Forces, or a visiting force. So this, I think, I feel that it would be particularly useful if there were visiting forces. For example, sometimes they might participate in an investigation, and there's a whole culture when we talk about visiting forces And they say it might be more difficult to investigate. People give their answers less happily. So to have better cooperation there, it might be useful in some cases. And if there's a language barrier, for example, they would be able to provide us with more information. So I think that this would be interesting to be able to see if these people will be bound to table a public report on their investigation, as is the case when it is the Transportation Safety Board, for example. So I think there will be questions to ask about that, and it will be worth looking at this more in depth in committee. In terms of Part 3, this amends the Canada Marine Act in relation to the effective day of the appointment of a director of a port authority. Concerning the first three parts, I feel that they are the ones that I have the fewest questions about, if you will. It's really parts 4 and 5 that concern me more, and I will be listening attentively and rereading the committee debates to really see what I believe the NDP should do when this bill will be at third reading stage in the House. That's why I sincerely hope that the Conservatives will be open-minded at committee and that they will really be prepared to discuss security, marine security, among other things, when we get into the study. So Part 4 amends the Marine Liability Act to implement the International Convention on Liability and Compensation for damage in connection with the carriage of hazardous and noxious substances, by sea. So this deals with responsibilities at the moment of oil spills, and it ensures that the owner of the ship is responsible for the costs incurred by the department if there was a spill, or if there was some other organization that was designated by the minister to deal with it. Therefore, it also gives force of law to many provisions of the convention. And one question that hasn't been raised as such in the bill, but I think that it would be of interest to discuss at committee, even if it's in another domain, is I think the issue of insurance coverage. We saw, unfortunately, with the Lac Mégantic incident, that the insurance coverage that the MMA company had was insufficient to cover the cost of what happened. So I think that in committee it would be worthwhile to study this issue. If we say that these people are responsible for paying, well, that means they have to have sufficient insurance coverage. There has to be a fairly precise assessment of how much it could cost if there really was a major incident, to ensure that those people have sufficient insurance coverage and that we don't find ourselves with companies that are in default on these payments while this spill continues to spread, because we don't know how we're going to settle that bill in the end. So I think that's going to be a very important issue to discuss in committee. As far as Part 5 is concerned, it amends the Canada Shipping Act, and it introduces new requirements for operators of oil handling facilities, including the requirement to notify the minister of their operations and to submit plans to the minister. So therefore, there are several parts here, and in this part of the law, or the bill, I think that we'll hopefully be able to provide a very precise description of what is going to be transported as fuel. We've seen that there are different descriptions of the types of oil that can be shipped, oil and gas, and I think that this will be part of the discussion we should have at committee. Therefore, there's a new requirement in the bill that ensures that those operators of oil handling facilities will have to present their plans to the minister for what they would do in the event of a problem. So I hope that they have an intervention plan. It means that they have also consulted the local communities. I do hope that there will be collaboration, so we can ensure that the local communities would be able potentially to help them and would know what to do, and also that they would be trained to do so. I think this is also an issue we must look at more in depth. We also look about civil and criminal immunity to the agents or mandataries of response organizations. And here I would ask for, well, how can I put this? An immunity that, is it immunity that applies in every case, or is it if in recognition that people acted to the best of their ability and knowledge? For example, if it's an organization that really cuts corners, would they also be as equally affected by this immunity? It would be important to clarify that, and that could be useful for the understanding of the members as regards the bill. Now, it also enforces new measures by applying the administrative monetary penalties regime for Transport Canada. And once again, if we're talking about monetary penalties, it's important to really discuss the amounts involved. Are these amounts high enough to really have a deterrent effect? Or are these amounts that might, how can we put it, say that they're not really significant enough to discourage people? So I think that we need to take the time, it would be worthwhile to do so, to discuss what the appropriate monetary penalties would be, so as to ensure that we achieve our goals with this. Therefore, with all of this bill, one of the components that's important to emphasize is really the fact that there's a bit of lack of credibility on the part of the Conservatives when you talk about marine and aviation safety. We've seen in budgets where significant cuts were made to security, and now we find ourselves with this bill, and I think there might have more credibility if they hadn't cut back so much on safety. For example, the Marine Sub-Center they closed in Quebec. It's not very far from my riding. That's a critical component. We have a Conservative government that has closed down this Marine Rescue Center that was the only Francophone one in the country. They were in charge of rapid response in cases of distress at sea. And now all of a sudden they want us to believe in their credibility when they talk about marine safety, when they have endangered the lives of people who could have intervened in these situations, emergency situations. So I think rather than asking, are the staff levels going to be increased to ensure that that safety will be assured, or are we going to have people who will be in a position to understand and to able to act in the case of an oil spill, for example, people who can work in both official languages? I think that these are questions we really need to ask, but unfortunately the Conservatives haven't helped us by making these cuts in terms of marine security and safety. They're cutting back on the staff of people who have concrete knowledge on the ground. I regularly saw people who would use expressions that are very, very local to talk about the areas in which they find themselves. And so if you have someone who isn't aware of the bodies of water in those areas, that's minutes or hours that are lost. It can take a lot more time sometimes to intervene. And if you're talking about some kind of spill, the more time it takes, the more damage is done. So I think that's a real danger. And unfortunately, the Conservatives really haven't impressed me when it's been an issue of marine safety. So I have real concerns. And I think that we really should ensure that this bill is complete. Unfortunately, by refusing to broaden the scope of the bill, we won't be reassured on that point. We won't be able to go as far as we'd like to go. So perhaps we'll have a bill but we'll realize that there's something that's not covered, and then we'll have to table another bill to cover that, and this bill will realize that once again it doesn't cover everything either, so this is going to get drawn out over time. We should just do some hard work and do it all in one fell swoop. We should really do a comprehensive study on marine safety, but that, it would seem, is not the way the Conservatives like to work. So when there are issues of logic in a bill like this, they come up short. There's another component that I think it would be worthwhile looking at, is that we know that to ensure marine safety, the Coast Guard is heavily involved. Now, recently we've had our defense critic who asked some questions of the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Public Works in order to find out what is happening with the shipbuilding program. Recently, there are people who did an assessment of this and saw that the money that had been set aside for this program say that it's really probably not going to be enough to see the program through. And yes, there will be ships used by national defense, but there are also ships involved, small ships, that will be used by the Coast Guard. So even in terms of this physical, of the staff and the physical infrastructure in terms of boats, if we can't ensure marine safety, there's a major problem, particularly if we take into consideration the fact that there is a significant increase in the number of boats that are in the waters off of our shores, but also of their size and the potential for spills occurring. So I think if the government really wanted to be serious when it's studying issues like marine safety, there are plenty of other measures they could have taken, like not reducing the services of the Coast Guard. And they should have not shut the Kitsilano base in BC and the Quebec Centre in Quebec. They're putting the terminal in St. John's, they're transferring the control of that, and I think everyone who has any concept of Canadian geography knows that these are crucial points when we're talking about marine safety in this country, whether it's on the East Coast or the West, with what's happening right now in terms of traffic. It's important to know that we have the capacity, but also that we continue to build that capacity. But instead, they are reducing and cutting back on the service. I also believe that it is important to require of the Canadian Coast Guard that they work in collaboration with their American counterparts when they're carrying out a parallel study to look at what's happening with oil shipping in Canadian waters. When we talk about ship traffic, well, they don't content themselves with staying just in Canadian waters. They move around. So it would be of interest to have joint studies, I think, and that's something that's particularly important and something that we should be able to discuss with our American counterparts so that we have intervention plans and include them in that planning. Because if we had a ship that were to unfortunately have an accident on the borders of Canadian and American waters, we should be able to really respond effectively and know who is going to play what role. I want to also specify that for the NDP, our objective is to never have any oil spills. But with all of the cutbacks we've seen implemented by the Conservatives in the area of marine safety, I think that we have concerns that are legitimate, and we'd like to know where we're headed when we talk about marine safety. We'd like to know, in the case of an oil spill, who is going to intervene, what the time frame would be, what are the objectives there, do we have the capacity to control a small oil spill as well as a large one. But currently, when the experts talk about this, if we talk about major ships, big ships, we don't have the capacity to deal with a major spill if that were to happen.
So I think that it is extremely worrisome in the committee, we will be able to look more in depth at these issues and ask questions, and we hope that the Conservative government will really be open in committee to improving marine safety and aviation safety for Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments?
Comments. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for her speech on this important matter. Yes, indeed, our party has agreed to support this bill to go to committee for discussion. I wonder if the member could speak to this. I know that she's worked in the military, and in the military, there's a lot of attention given to making sure that you have properly staffed and trained your personnel for any initiative or mission. Something that troubles me with the repeated actions of this government is that they table laws either to amend the criminal code, introducing new provisions or regulatory statutes, and now matters dealing with very serious issues, including aeronautic safety and marine spills, and yet have not simultaneously tabled a policy and strategy for ensuring improved enforcement and compliance, and for staffing and training to ensure that these measures are lived up to. I wonder if the member could speak to that.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that in keeping with my military experience, I've found that the regulations have to be carefully adapted to various situations. The more uncertainty there is, the more difficult it is to respond. So the response plans have to be very carefully thought out in consultation with local authorities and with the Americans if there is the international boundary involved. Well, therefore, the more solidly we do that kind of work, the better we can respond. In this kind of legislation, we need to take the time to look at the different aspects carefully and look at all the possibilities so that we are prepared to act if we ever have to. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for her excellent, informative speech. She's always well informed. I would like to talk about the 10,000-ton measures that are in the bill. It says that we have to have a response capacity to deal with that, but we know that the tankers carry much more oil than that. One association indicated that the limit should be 50,000 tons. So could my colleague speak to this? Is 10,000 tons an adequate number when we're looking at the current oil tanker reality? The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, no. The current 10,000-ton limit is not adequate. This is one of the proposals we would like to make. We would like to see an increase in this threshold where there is an oil spill. So we will be asking this question of the various groups that come before us in committee. Right now we have this 10,000-ton limit. The company has to be able to deal with a 10,000-ton oil spill. And if the company can't do the cleanup, then the Coast Guard has to get involved directly or to contract other response authorities to do the work. If the company is unable to pay for the cleanup, then the Coast Guard can seek funding from the Industry Indemnity Fund. The government then might have to end up paying the costs of the cleanup. Unfortunately, the problem is that right now, in this fund, in March 2013, there was $400,000. But in concrete terms, when we're looking at a full cleanup after the Exxon Valdez, the costs were $3.5 billion. So obviously, the fund does not cover the real costs. There is an inadequate amount of money available if we ever had a major oil spill. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Charles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my region, I'm near the Gaspé Peninsula. The St. Lawrence River goes through our area. We've got the Marine National Park, and there is a study underway of the various marine environments. Can the member tell us if there are any steps being taken, because we know there are a lot of tankers that go through this area, to protect this environment in the National Marine Park? The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From what I've read in the bill, I don't see any provisions to protect those environments. As I mentioned earlier, the expertise at the Search and Rescue Center in Quebec City was really aimed at dealing with emergency situations on ships and so on, but there was the expertise, the francophones that could deal with other situations, and we are losing that expertise, the francophones. We know that we don't have really the bilingual expertise elsewhere to respond. In the St. Lawrence River environment, we have an exceptional ecosystem. The communities are very close to the shoreline, and so there could be a great deal of damage. When we look at the Gaspé Peninsula, there is a great deal of economic dependence on tourism. So if there were ever to be a major oil spill, people would not go there for months. So this is not practical. There would be major repercussions both on the ecosystem and on the local economy. Questions and comments? One last question, the Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to be able to ask another question. My colleague mentioned in her remarks the issue of insurance that the industry has to have. We had the example of Lac Mégantic. That was the rail sector, of course, but a similar situation could arise in shipping. So I'd like to know from her whether companies have enough insurance to deal with a major oil spill. And, of course, major oil spills can create huge damage. Does she feel that these companies need to have insurance which would allow them to address the real danger of the products that they are shipping? The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, 1 minute, please. Thank you. This is a key point, and when this bill is before the committee, I hope we will have the opportunity to talk about some of the concrete examples of situations around the world, of the costs. I mentioned a case where the costs were as high as $3.5 or $6 billion. So we have real situations. We also have the potential situations. And we will have experts appearing before the committee. The committee can therefore look at the level of insurance that companies should have,